Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Geraldine Byrne-Nason, the Permanent Representative of Ireland. Delighted to say Céad Míle Fáilte Roimh. You're all extremely welcome to our event this evening in the presence and really led by our Chief of Staff, who had the unfortunate incident at lunch of introducing him as the Admirable Admiral, but I think he is the Admirable Admiral, and I'll get back to that in a moment. So you're all very welcome here to our event this evening. As you'll see in the material that you have in front of you, it's the fourth in a series of lectures we're undertaking here at the Irish Mission with Fordham University's Institute of International Humanitarian Affairs, and we're very appreciative to them and their representatives this evening. Our speaker tonight, and indeed the topic, I think are really particularly germane to a country like Ireland, the country I have the honour to represent here. It brings together two, I would say, critical and long-standing priorities for Ireland: peacekeeping and humanitarian action. Peacekeeping is absolutely at the heart of Ireland's UN vocation. In over 60 years, we have not had a single day since we first deployed members of our defence forces on the ground with the UN. Not a single day has passed without an Irish peacekeeper working somewhere across the globe wearing a blue beret. I think that our own, closer to home, our own lived experience of conflict has given us a very particular empathy for people who live in conflict settings. We actually know what fragility looks like, and we also, importantly, I think, know what it feels like to be in a fragile environment. And that's whether it's on the tiny island of Ireland dropped into the Atlantic, whether it's in Lebanon, in Bosnia, in Liberia. Fragility, conflict, what it does alters societies. We know about that, and I think we bring that understanding to everything we do in our work here at the UN, in the corridors, but importantly our work on the ground in efforts to try and bring stability and ultimately, ideally, to resolve conflict. Our long tradition of humanitarian action has been bolstered by that understanding, I believe. And sadly, that's a long tradition that's actually now needed more than ever. We see the number of armed conflicts worldwide dramatically multiplying, particularly in the last decade. More people than ever, statistics that are shocking indeed, in need of humanitarian support. And we know that humanitarian need is increasingly driven by fragility and armed conflict. I only need to name check three quickly: Yemen, Syria, the Sahel region. That just simply illustrates the point, but doesn't in any way describe the scale of the challenge. We also know from our own experience, we discussed some of this with Mark today, that in countries where UN mandated peacekeeping operations are working on the ground, the protection of civilians and humanitarian assistance is actually growing in terms of need, but also in terms of being mission critical on the ground to the work in real life, day-to-day operations. That's a need that's not just a need identified in UN reports, in the papers that we exchange amongst us, or indeed in political reporting. This is a real live need. So as we set mandates for missions, for peacekeeping missions, peace building, we believe as Irish that it's essential that we recognise and understand the important link between peace building, peacekeeping, conflict resolution, and ending humanitarian need. So that's the sort of the complex of issues that we hope that tonight we can explore. And it's why we're particularly proud to have our Chief of Staff of the Irish Defence Forces speak to a lifelong experience, I think, Mark, of peacekeeping and humanitarian action. Chief of Staff Mark Mellett has over 40 years service as an officer in the Irish Defence Forces. Admiral Mellet has extensive experience both at home and abroad including service in Afghanistan and Lebanon in combined and joint operational missions. Mark began his military career as an army reservist before being selected for a naval cadetship, and during his time as a specialist naval diving officer and commander, he participated in and led numerous counter-terrorism and counter-narcotics operations, for which he was awarded the Distinguished Service Medal by the Irish government for his leadership. I'm proud to say that Mark is the first naval officer in the Irish state to serve as Chief of Staff, and you previously served as Deputy Chief of Staff and, of course, Chief of the Navy. I think you'll pick up as Mark speaks to you tonight that his experience goes beyond his extensive military career. His expertise grows out of the work he did also in the academic field. He's the holder of a doctorate in political science, has been a visiting professor in the University of Liverpool, Hope University, and is an adjunct professor of law at University College Cork. So, Mark, it's both a professional and personal privilege to have you with us here visiting New York, but we're really looking forward to some provoking and inspiring thoughts from you this evening. So, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome our Chief of Staff, Chief of Defence Forces of Ireland, Vice Admiral Mark, I did it again, Mark Mellett. I'm sorry, Mark.
Geraldine, thanks very much. 43 years service, what we would say in the Defence Forces, that's a long time to be idle. But Your Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, it's a privilege to be here to contribute to the Ireland at Fordham Humanitarian lecture series on the theme Sustainable Development Goals and Common Values, a vital framework for humanitarian action. There are a number of themes that I'd like to develop, and these include the importance of collaboration and partnerships, innovation and diversity. I'll position these themes in the context of multilateralism, building to my key point, which centres on the importance of the Sustainable Development Goals and common values in providing a framework for humanitarian action. The Irish Defence Forces are a key component of the security architecture of the Irish state, and when all is said and done, we're part of the bedrock that underpins our state sovereignty, part of the framework that provides for the institutions of our civilised society. And for me, a civilised society is built on values, providing a framework for universal human rights. The right to live in a civilised society is a human right of every man, woman and child. It's where people are free, where the institutions of state function, and where the vulnerable are protected. I recently read Almost Human by Lee Berger. It traces the discovery of the species Homo naledi, a previously unknown, now extinct hominin that existed over 250,000 years ago. The hominin species predated Homo sapiens, from which we have all descended, but it made me think of the principles and the values that evolve with civilization and how they influence how we know right from wrong. More recently, I read The Jungle Grows Back by Robert Kagan, which further added to my thoughts in creating a paradigm, a continuum, if you like, between the uncivilized and the institutions of a civilized society, between insecurity and security, between the absence of peace and peace. As a fundamental principle, I see the role of Ireland's Defence Forces to contribute to an effort to move institutions along the continuum from insecurity to security and from an absence of peace to peace. Our military is not an end in itself. We are the guarantor of our state's sovereignty and sovereign rights that are not upheld are more imaginary than real. Internationally, I see us as a servant working with others, politicians, diplomats, NGOs, entrepreneurs, lawyers, investors, and always within an appropriate institutional framework, often involved in the European Union, but nearly always underwritten by the United Nations. 400 years ago, the English poet in For Whom the Bell Tolls wrote, "No man is an island entire of itself. Each is a piece of the continent, a part of the main. If a clod be washed away by the sea, Europe is the less." His words were prophetic when we consider what's happening today, but my sense of his key message is that we are interdependent. Today, in a world of breakneck speed, in terms of change and knowledge generation, when we are physically experiencing the effects of climate breakdown and biodiversity loss, we have never been more interdependent. We are in the era of the Anthropocene, an era in which it is human activity that is the dominant influence on climate and the environment. Earth's history points to 5 mass extinction events. When we think of the last 2 in particular, I think you will agree that reptiles and dinosaurs were not responsible for their demise. They didn't know they were about to become extinct, and even if they did, they couldn't do anything about it. Humans are different. In the context of animals, we have an extraordinary intelligence. Aristotle marked out this difference, reflecting that we are rational animals pursuing knowledge for its own sake. We live by art and reasoning, he wrote, while Suddendorf suggests humans have radically different possibility of thinking. So as a species, if we are to survive, in my view, the principle of multilateralism has never been more important. It must become a defining feature for the institutions of a civilized society. It is essential for human security. In Europe, notwithstanding the Balkan Wars, we've enjoyed an extraordinary period of peace and security. This security has in no small way been the result of the multilateral manner in which the values and principles of the European Union have been institutionalized, building on the philosophy of Robert Schuman. But, and this is a point that Kagan makes, the institutions of the European Union were facilitated by initiatives such as the Marshall Plan, a plan which at the time provided over $15 billion to support a programme for recovery. A recovery that in the decades that followed was complemented by US interest in Europe. But this is changing, and a new language of unilateralism is emerging. Ireland is in the top 7% of most peaceful countries according to the Global Peace Index. We're so fortunate to have civil society, market and government institutions that are well grounded. But there are many countries, however, where this is not the case, and the gap continues to grow between the absence of peace and peace, between insecurity and security, and between uncivilized actions and a civilized society. For over 60 years, Irish soldiers have served in some of the most challenging environments in the world. Ireland's approach in providing assistance to victims of armed conflicts and other emergencies is to stress the importance of coherent, complementary and coordinated actions within a multilateral framework. We emphasise the importance of systematically integrating protections of civilians and gender-based violence initiatives into policy and practice to protect the most vulnerable, especially women and girls. In our assistance programmes, we in Ireland also recognise the importance of enhancing resilience by strengthening the capacity of countries, communities, institutions and individuals to anticipate and adapt to shocks and stresses. Our women and men, soldiers, sailors and aircrew have contributed to almost 70,000 individual tours of duty. Our women and men have and continue to give the leadership, such as that by General Maureen O'Brien in Syria and General Michael Berry in Lebanon previously. We've stood up to violent extremists. We've freed hostages. It is in these missions we come face to face, however, with the simple reality that freedom is not free. And while on this point it's appropriate to remember the 87 members of the Defence Forces who have died in the service of international peace, including those soldiers who remain missing in action in Lebanon and Congo. In recent years, we've contributed to the rescue of over 23,000 women, men and children in the Mediterranean, with Irish naval ships recovering over 18,000, many of whom were drowning at the time of recovery. For many of these rescued people, the first semblance of a civil society, experienced in months, if not years, was that experience on the afterdeck of an Irish sovereign warship under the Irish tricolour or flag. But there are many who are not so fortunate, and one of our naval commanders reflected, no one was unaffected by this and what they saw on the mission. Crew members were faced with hundreds of people struggling in front of them, in the water or on sinking vessels, and with having to make a decision rescuing one person, knowing that might mean another would not be pulled to safety. We've seen hundreds of people die. We've recovered many bodies. According to the Global Peace Index, over the last 10 years, there has been a general deterioration of global peace and security, and I see further growing challenges. As I speak to you this evening, we have 2 wars in Europe's borders, a full-scale hybrid war in Ukraine where over 10,000 people have died. In Syria, where Irish troops serve with UNDOF, multiple proxy wars are still being prosecuted. It's been reported that over 500,000 people have died and over 6 million people have been displaced in that conflict. Geraldine, you mentioned Yemen. And there's also evidence that notwithstanding reports to the contrary, the remnants of ISIS in Iraq and Syria are consolidating, while others have relocated elsewhere to countries like Libya. Some have linked up with disparate violent extremist groups, influencing further south across the Sahel. And there are indications of ISIS consolidating in an arc from Mauritania to Nigeria, encompassing the Boko Haram foothold. And this should worry us. The situation in Mali, where Ireland contributes to both the UN and EU missions, continues to deteriorate. Troops serving with the United Nations multi-dimensional integrated stabilisation force have been subjected to many attacks and significant loss of life. There have been multiple atrocities involving civilian communities, above which you are familiar. Only last Tuesday, 3 of our soldiers were injured in what appeared to be a targeted improvised explosive device strike. Thankfully, they're well. I spoke to them last Wednesday. Their attitude was stoic, wanting to get back to service, doing what they are there for, that is, to facilitate a safe and secure environment. Just like the other 600 Irish soldiers, sailors and aircrew who serve in peacekeeping and humanitarian missions in 13 countries and 14 missions as I speak. The porous borders of the Sahel are a challenge, in particular in places such as the tri-border area of Mali, Burkina Faso and Niger. There is a sense that the insecurity is influencing westwards towards the Gulf of Guinea, where the illegal trade in weapons and people trafficking is mixed with narcotics trafficking, fueling criminality in the region and beyond, which spills into Europe and beyond. This insecurity also drives irregular migration, and while we must treat symptoms in places like the Mediterranean, the only cure and the only hope for a cure is to treat the root cause. There are other forces driving instability in and between states. For example, state-sponsored cyber and espionage are becoming more prevalent. They undermine democratic institutions and they threaten critical national infrastructure. The rise in the right is driving more nationalistic tendencies, which in many cases is triggered in responses to irregular migration, often fueled by fake news, sometimes reinforced by toxic social media narratives. I've mentioned the loss of biodiversity and the impact of climate breakdown, both of which are being exacerbated by the effects of population increase. 200 years ago, there were 1 billion people in the world. The UN estimate our population will pass 10 billion by around 2050. And all of this is forcing on the expanding continuum from where we should be getting more civilized towards greater insecurity and an absence of peace. But there are positives, and these are linked to my earlier points relating to human intelligence. Every day we hear of, and increasingly we experience, the positive impacts from the growth of automation, the growth in robotics, and the acceleration in the growth of technology. These are driving the Internet of Things, enhancing artificial and augmented intelligence, with the explosion of data presenting huge opportunity. Data drives information, which fuels and feeds the increase and creation of new knowledge and greater understanding. And what does this mean for humanitarian action? Well, 3 things are clear. Firstly, if we leverage the knowledge available, own, open source, or partner, and recognise every moment new technologies and new ways of doing things are being created, we reduce risk. Secondly, if we recognise the rate of increase in the creation of new knowledge means that it has a decreasing half-life, and we are adaptive to this reality, we reduce risk. And thirdly, the simple reality is that such an acceleration in the generation of new knowledge and new technologies is in our interests and in the interests of our partners to collaborate, and that collaboration should take place in a framework of common values and common goals, such as the Sustainable Development Goals. And if we do this, we will make greater impact on humanitarian actions. But there are a number of other features that should characterise or inform the nature of collaboration and our partnerships. We must innovate and create arrangements to support diversity, including diversity and inclusion. This will help ensure greater impact in humanitarian operations. Innovation is a systematic change in mindset that permeates entire organisations. Increasingly, the answers to our challenging problems lie outside our organisational boundaries. It's my view that we must be open to cede power, to gain power. We must tame egos and accept that we are increasingly interdependent. Einstein is credited with saying that ego equals 1 over knowledge. Unfortunately, in my experience, there are too many people who know just enough to have an ego. Egos often drive the maintenance of silos that undermine better collaboration, trust, efficiency, and effectiveness. To enhance our capacity for service delivery, including performance in humanitarian and peacekeeping operations in the military, we recognise that opportunities come to pass, not to pause. We need to enable and empower our personnel to act with greater autonomy. We are driving mission command that's enabling greater freedom of action for subordinates within a framework of values and in keeping with the commander's intent. We are increasing risk tolerance, recognising that while creativity and making mistakes are inseparable twins, mistakes are the portals of discovery. In complex organisations, mistakes are inevitable. What is important is the solid governance for risk mitigation being in place. And this requires a culture of learning, where lessons are identified, leading to that learning, a culture where we are endeavouring to make a just culture, where there is balanced accountability. In the context of humanitarian and peacekeeping operations, innovation must also be cross-sectoral, and the potential dividend for humanitarian action is clear. This requires greater alignment between peacekeeping forces and humanitarian NGOs. The messages articulated by Ramalingan et al. For innovation in international humanitarian action are applicable to every sector, contributing to an integrated approach. Innovation stimulates positive change, providing new ways of delivering assistance to those who need it most. Innovation demands new ways of thinking where we challenge the status quo. Instead of being satisfied with incremental improvements in delivery of aid, for example, innovation requires a boneless that continuously asks the question, is there a better way to do this? This may involve a different partnership, a different model, a new process for service delivery, or leveraging a new technology, or all three. But innovation doesn't happen by accident. It requires leadership, education, collaboration, and understanding. It needs to be raised to a strategic priority. It's not necessarily just about inventing something new, but rather it could be about applying something that is proven elsewhere in a new setting. For example, greater leveraging of the 4 Ps approach, the product or the service, the price, the place, and the promotion, how it is communicated, have relevance in the context of peacekeeping and humanitarian operations. Innovation is neither fixed nor linear, with the theory and practice of innovation evolving continually. While it can happen by accident, to be sustainable, it requires a deliberative and proactive shift in understanding and culture that leaves us ready to seize those fleeting opportunities. Open innovation should be supported by effective information sharing within and between organisations, maintaining networks and ready to codify partnerships with counterparts within and beyond the sector. States, regional bodies and indeed the UN itself can encourage sector-wide mechanisms to promote and facilitate innovation for humanitarian action. Safe and appropriate spaces for experimenting and innovating should be stimulated for the humanitarian sector. Prevention is better than cure, and treating symptoms alone will not cure the root cause. A focus on innovation can help to support a shift towards proactive work to prevent disasters rather than only reacting after the event, and towards increasing local ownership of humanitarian activities, enabling a shift from catastrophe-first innovation towards vulnerability first. Complementing innovation, we need to strive to, firstly, diversify in our networks and partnerships, and secondly, to enhance diversity internally. Research has linked more diverse leadership with better governance and risk management. It shows a correlation between gender diverse boards and the increased likelihood of staff adhering to codes of conduct and better communication, as well as better financial management. Humanitarian and peacekeeping efforts are actioned in a comprehensive and integrated manner. In terms of external diversity, We must strive to increase opportunities for external collaboration, for instance, seeking to mix state with enterprise and with higher education institutes and civil society actors. In my experience, the greater the diversity in terms of external networks, the greater the potential in terms of potential disruptive, innovative outcomes. The World Humanitarian Summit has reaffirmed the values of conveying a diversity of stakeholders to develop solutions to shared problems. Only by harnessing the skills and ideas of a diverse range of stakeholders can we respond to the magnitude of the challenges and implement changes on the scale required. For many years, I've been to the forefront advocating for open, diverse networks to sense and explore answers to our challenging problems. In some cases, we have created diverse partnerships to seize and exploit these ideas with a view to creating new technologies with end-user solutions to end-user identified problems. We've worked with academia, enterprise and others, and it was such a partnership that enabled our defence forces, medical teams responding to the Ebola crisis in Sierra Leone to be equipped with cutting-edge technology such as contactless thermometers before that technology was available on the market. And more recently, we've worked with researchers developing a cellulose-based material for wipes and masks, specifically designed to capture microbes, such as COVID-19 virus, trapping them inside the material, thereby reducing transmission of the pathogen. This philosophy is why, in terms of our core profession, we require more holistic perspectives, developing our personnel, not just in traditional military skills, but also as scholars who understand the language of others, and diplomats who can build the alliances necessary to underpin the integrated perspectives and partnerships required for humanitarian action when working with others. I've made a case for diversity in terms of the external partnership, and the same goes from the internal organisational perspective. Spanning external and internal diversity is an appreciation of the importance of science, technology, engineering and maths, so-called STEM. However, in addition to STEM, we must leverage the arts, encompassing social and political sciences. They define how relationships are formed and how alliances are built. For us in the Defence Forces, this has implications for how we develop our personnel. Whereas previously we trained our personnel for scenarios we can predict, now in a world of complexity, we also educate our personnel for scenarios we cannot predict. No longer is it sufficient to be a competent soldier-warrior. There are other perspectives that are also important. We require a seamless change from being a warrior to a scholar, understanding the perspective of others as a diplomat. Facilitating cross-cutting structures within our military requires developed diplomatic skills in our personnel to nurture and build collaborative networks. Almost everywhere we operate, we work with partners. Arts, encompassing social and political sciences, enhances the knowledge that build and connect institutions. In the context of our effectiveness for humanitarian action, we see our drive to enable diversity internally, developing a diversity and inclusion strategy as critical. Someone once said diversity is about being invited to the party. Inclusion is about being asked to dance. It's built around, for example, culture, creed, ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, and even age. Sutton et al. Point out how high-performing teams have both visible and invisible diversity characteristics. Visible diversity can enable access to knowledge and networks specific to a particular group, whilst invisible diversity can support productivity and problem solving. The effects of diversity are additive for all diversity dimensions, so rather than focusing on one specific aspect of diversity, the goal is to create teams that are diverse across multiple dimensions. It's the mix that matters. And innovation and diversity are not exclusive. On my Twitter account feed, you'll see a picture of a young man. His name is Charlie. Charlie is 15 and a half. Charlie wrote me a lovely letter full of empathy and caring. He wanted to go to Syria. Charlie wants to help our soldiers and make safe and secure environments for people in dangerous places. He feels he can communicate with his age. Charlie has special needs, and in his own words, at times he is hard to understand. Charlie has helped our Defence Forces understand a broader perspective. He has attended with our troops before their deployment to places like Syria, And last year, when our values champions received their awards from the President of Ireland, Charlie received a special award also. Within every organisation, but the military in particular, institutionalising a gender perspective, gender equality and empowerment of women are all capability drivers. Ireland and our defence forces have been to the forefront in terms of women, peace and security. I'm well aware that gender-based violence and sexual exploitation and abuse are features of many conflicts. They've been prosecuted as war crimes, crimes against humanity, and in certain instances, the most grievous of all crimes, the crime of genocide. One of the strongest indicators of intra- and interstate violence is the gender gap. The Global Gender Gap Index is an index designed to measure gender equality. When compared to the Global Index for Peace, the results are stark, clear and unambiguous. There's a relationship between the size of the gender gap and the absence of peace. I'm proud of Ireland's leadership in terms of women, peace and security. Our Defence Forces contributed to the production of our 3 national action plans. Within our forces, we are working hard to institutionalise a gender perspective amongst all our personnel. In a male-dominated organisation, it is as much a male issue as it is a female issue. I acknowledge that I have much to do to progress our Defence Forces in terms of improving gender balance. I am, however, acutely aware that empowerment of women, gender equality and closing the gender gap is a societal issue which requires a multifaceted approach to address. The winner of a recent study in an Irish national science competition for pre-university students found that gender stereotyping in 5 to 7-year-old girls was actually being reinforced by their 5 to 7-year-old boy colleagues. This has implications not just in terms of science, technology, engineering and maths, but also for achieving greater gender balance in the militaries. Better gender balance in our militaries is not a matter of political correctness. It's not just about access to a further 50% of the population. It's not just about being a better reflection of the society we defend, protect and serve. It's a capability issue, which makes us better at what we do. It enhances our capability in peacekeeping and humanitarian action. And so I come to the nexus between values, the Sustainable Development Goals and humanitarian action. Progressing along the continuum from insecurity and absence of peace towards sustainable institutions of a civilised society is about striving for common values. Values are a vital framework for everything we do, and yet we often take them for granted. Values provide a glue for common action. Values are the bridge between insecurity and the institutions of civil society. And yet too often they are being undermined, often by seemingly smart people. Within our Defence Forces in recent years, we've dedicated significant effort to institutionalise our values and action in everything we do. In a world where power is inverted, where the advent of social media has meant that rapid change and complexity are the norm, it's never been more important that as leaders we seek to influence values at every level, international, governmental, regional, institutional level, state level, as well as organisational and personal level. In our Defence Forces, our values include the moral courage to do the right thing, the physical courage to persevere despite danger and adversity, a respect that treats others as they should be treated, an integrity that encompasses honesty, sincerity and reliability, a loyalty to state, to our comrades, and a selflessness which puts duty before ourselves. From an organisational perspective, values have an inward and outward dimension. They help us make us stronger as organisations, but they also define how we will engage with others. So values are enablers for better innovation and richer diversity. But values are also about how we adhere to the law, international humanitarian law, law of armed conflict, and the law of war. Values are about ethical practice. The law of armed conflict, with its principles such as distinction, humanity, proportionality, and precaution, has a close relationship with and takes its foundation from ethical basis. Ethics and the law coalesce to form a necessary combination that is demanded of the conduct of conflict today. Those who do not adhere to legal and ethical standards may find themselves indicted before a court such as the International Criminal Court. The Defence Forces, our Defence Forces, incorporates ethics and law as a key enabler in the conduct of our operations, most particularly in peace support operations. Although peace support operations are not war, it is in a post-conflict atmosphere where the highest ethical and legal standards are necessary. The peace support force must maintain a disciplined and professional approach in operations, all supported by an understanding of ethics, in our case aligning with our Defence Forces values and with the legal requirements of the Geneva and Hague Conventions. While I've articulated the case for values, my key point is that institutionalizing values at an organisational level is a critical component in the context of nested governance, where common values linked to sustainable development goals drive a framework for humanitarian action. 31 years ago, the Brundtland Commission in Our Common Future was one of the first seminal reflections to advocate a holistic approach to the key principle of sustainable development. In the context of the norms and principles that underpin good governance and inform our values, sustainable development should be what Axelrod describes as a meta-norm, that is something for which we self-penalise, or we should self-penalise for non-compliance. Brundtland also advocated multilateralism and corporate social responsibility. There's clear congruence between Brundtland's findings and the Sustainable Development Goals, and the codification of the UN's 17 Sustainable Development Goals was co-sponsored by Ireland and Kenya. Attainment of these goals requires governance that is comprehensive and integrated. They represent a universal call for action to end poverty, protect the planet, and ensure that all people enjoy peace and prosperity by 2030. They are fundamental to the framework for humanitarian action. They address the global challenge we face, including those related to poverty, inequality, climate change, environmental degradation, peace and justice. The goals are integrated in that action in one area will affect the outcome in others, and the development must balance social, economic and environmental sustainability. Accordingly, they frame the integrated approach. Innovation, diversity and values shape how we will leverage these goals. Ireland is an extraordinary country with a charisma that underpins a reputation for doing good, a reputation that is inextricably linked with values, a reputation that is a driver of multilateralism, a reputation that is a form of power, enabling a small state on the periphery of Europe to play a leadership role on the international stage. A reputation for empathy that has a resonance from Africa to Afghanistan and beyond to the Philippines and the small island states. Ireland's values are for a fairer world, a just world, a secure world and a sustainable world. Our values have been forged in a furnace of famine and migration. Our foreign policy is deeply anchored in the values set out in our Constitution. These are also reflected in the Charter of the United Nations, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and in the principles which underpin the European Union. And this explains Ireland's sustained, strong commitment to multilateralism. Common values involve a marriage of our strategic intent as conveyed by the diktats of Irish civil society and our ethical approach to the conduct of operation. They are of relevance in the context of the benchmarks and goals set out for us by the membership of the international community and our responsibility to protect, to lead, and to assist our fellow citizens. We live in an extraordinary time where the rate of change is as if we're at war, and yet we act as if we are at peace. We are seeing more unknown unknowns, black swan events. We now have black elephants, known unknowns. And I've recently spoken about black rabbits, where our wicked problems collide in a perfect storm of climate change and biodiversity loss, breeding even greater unknowns. There has seldom been a period in our history where values-based leadership was so important. That's why I think the leadership being shown by Ireland in competing for a seat in the Security Council is so important. Our bid is not about status. It's not about status or power. It's about values and multilateralism. The American philosopher Mary Parker Follett said, leadership is not so much about the exercise of power, but about the capacity to create that sense of power in those who are led. The real role of a leader is to create more leaders. So as leaders, we all must do our bit, from top down and bottom up, to ensure, for example, the Sustainable Development Goals are being properly codified at state level and within our organisations. We must ensure our values are codified, actioned, championed and recognised. We should all push back where we see cynical populism. We must double our efforts to embrace diversity and inclusion so that society and organisations allow people to be whole, to belong. We must champion gender equality and empowerment of women, being alert to stereotyping and shifting the inertia in areas such as science, technology, engineering, maths and military. In this, the 20th anniversary of UN Security Council Resolution 1325, it's our duty to use all our power to close the gender gap. The gender gap is a driver of violence and insecurity. Leadership, like innovation, is also about risk-taking and mistakes. Clausewitz said in More, everything is simple, but even the simplest thing is difficult. In a world of growing complexity, it's inevitable that mistakes will happen, but mistakes drive learning. I'm comforted by the words of George Bernard Shaw, who said, a life spent making mistakes is not only more honourable, but more useful than a life doing nothing. In summary, in a world of complexity, we are increasingly interdependent, and sharing knowledge is critical. Increasing complexity characterised by wicked problems, growing insecurity and challenging vectors on one hand, and the explosion in data, knowledge and understanding on the other, necessitate that we should be collaborating and partnering rather than isolating. Our collaboration should be characterised by innovation and diversity and be built on values which help to ensure our understanding is applied with wisdom. Knowledge and understanding without values leads to populism, unilateralism and selfishness. Knowledge and understanding in a framework of values leads to multilateralism that drives the potential for wisdom. George Bernard Shaw said, we are made wise not by the recollection of the past, but by our responsibility for the future. Progressing along the continuum from the insecurity and absence of peace towards sustainable institutions of a civilized society requires leadership, values-based leadership. Values are inextricably linked to character, and as leaders we need to accentuate that character. If we are to ensure the appropriate culture in our organisations, we need a culture we proactively design, rather than one we react to by default. While I've articulated the case for our values, my key point is that institutionalizing values at an organisational level is a critical component in the context of nested governance, where common values linked to the Sustainable Development Goals drive a vital framework for humanitarian action. It's been said that the eyes of the future are looking back at us and praying that we see beyond our time. The UN is a remarkable institution, and when all is said and done, it is us. When I think of the UN, I think of the words of John F. Kennedy, who in a speech to be conveyed in Dallas that tragically was never delivered, reflected, we in this generation are, by destiny, rather than by choice, the watchmen on the walls of world freedom. We ask, therefore, that we may be worthy of our power and responsibility, that we may exercise our strength with wisdom and restraint, and that we may achieve in our time and for all time the ancient vision of peace on earth, goodwill towards men, and I add women. That must always be our goal, and the righteousness of our cause must always underlie our strength. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Mark. That was a truly magisterial presentation for us of the really complex environment that the title belies tonight. I mean, I think I said at the beginning, I hoped you'd inspire us and provoke us, and you did both in real depth. And I must say we're hugely appreciative. You brought the knowledge of the operational requirements in our current, I suppose, difficult political context. But I think you were admirably provocative in encouraging us to think as we look at mandates about issues like risk tolerance, You talked to us about the innovation between peacekeeping and humanitarian action, which actually, by definition, the nexus itself challenges the status quo and our capacity to look at other actors, which many of you here from a non-governmental background may have views on. But I think importantly, you brought us to the notion of how that we need to look at how we embed that and use diversity as a facilitator. I was particularly struck by the way you spoke about the evolutionary nature of the capacities that we now need to deliver both peacekeeping and humanitarian action, and the idea that you, in the past, we could train people for operational responsibilities on the ground. Now it's a matter of educating for the unpredictable situations that we're facing. And then the powerful message you make that brings us right back to where Ireland, in many ways, you said it yourself, will begin and end with a values-based bridge to everything we do. And we see that as the greatest bulwark against insecurity, against injustice, and against a failure and a risk that we don't actually deliver on that wonderful SDG framework that we hold so dear to. So it was really a completely comprehensive and as I say, very provocative from my point of view, presentation. And I'm sure that many people in the audience will want to take up some of those thoughts. So we have a roving mic. If you would put up your hand, if you wish to address a question, and then identify or before you address your question, identify who you are, the organisation you represent, and I'm sure the Chief of Staff will be happy to take up that question. So I'm looking for hands in the audience, or the terrible risk is that I'll occupy the microphone for a little bit longer. Okay, well maybe I will occupy the mic. There is a hand. I can't see you, so the microphone is if you could identify yourself.
Yes, my name is Joe Lawton. I teach at Fordham University in the Visual Arts Department. You laid out a beautiful plan and description of values and sharing in today's political climate, not only in our own country, but in Europe. Are you an optimist, or as a realist, what do you think the chances of achieving these goals are?
I have to be an optimist. What I always say about values are not about perfection, they are about commitment. And that's the reason I put them in the context of mistakes. And I think if we're comfortable with that paradigm, then I am an optimist. I think at times we don't talk enough about values. We have two lines in our defence forces, and it's only in the last few years we've really started pushing. First of all is our values champions, whereby we ask people in the organisation to pick their peer who best reflects a particular value. And a funny story on that, I remember ringing the girl who got the value for selflessness, and she started crying, and when she finished crying, she said, "Surely somebody deserves this more than me." But she was nominated by about 200 of her peers, and the other value champions are the same. But the next stage is the sophistication of values and action. And I read them out there, the values and action. And what we try to do now is in all our orders and all our instructions, that we want to see a reflection of each of our values of moral courage, physical courage, respect, integrity, loyalty, and selflessness, actioned in our activities. And that's where it will stick. If you can do that, make it part of your the way you do your business. So I hope that we infect others with our ideas, but I think talking about it certainly is a good step.
Thank you.
So, looking to see if there are any further questions. Maybe as people ponder, I can ask you an honours maths one, just to bring you back to the concept of bringing peacekeepers and humanitarian workers, if we're talking about operational terms, closer together. You said that will demand, and I think we accept that, a change in the status quo. We spoke earlier today a little bit about how some peacekeeping mandates don't even include a protection of civilians. How challenging do you see that, both from the point of view of delivery on the ground, where there's a sensitivity, but also if you could reflect a little bit about the challenge for those, for example, of the Security Council designing mandates for force commanders who are in fragile situations. how is that managed with a host country? How's it managed with a range of non-state actors locally? How do you actually deliver that?
Well, I think, first of all, from a military point of view, in peacekeeping or other operations, we have to accept that the military are not an end in themselves. They're an enabler of an environment that is a safe and hopefully secure environment where good stuff can happen. So therefore, I think there has to be a dialogue between those who are endeavouring to make the environment for stuff to happen, to talk to the other stakeholders who have a key part. This is what you know as the integrated approach. So to talk to the NGO community, to see how we can work together with regards to the embedding the institution or institution building, providing support to civil society, but in a manner which does not compromise the integrity of the NGO community. I've often spoken with NGOs who say there always has to be a separation between the military and the NGO community because their independence is critical in the context of their own security. But there is a point, I think, whereby there does need to be, I think, more strategic engagement in the context of how we work together. And I saw this in Afghanistan myself, where I established just a network between NGO community, between the interim government arrangements in Kabul, between the ISAF forces, between the UN, and between the coalition forces, which were US and UK. And we worked together. And it actually was quite powerful. And it was certainly a case whereby the outcome was bigger than the sum of the parts. But the key piece is the trustworthiness and to understand and to have a reciprocity that one isn't going to try and leverage the other to the point of compromising in terms of values. But that is about, I think, talking as early as possible in terms of what are the possibilities to work together.
We have a member of the team here in the House who's taking the risk of challenging the Chief of Staff.
I'm not sure I'm going to challenge. Thank you, Vice Admiral. That was an extremely interesting overview of a huge range of issues and factors that we deal with here at the UN. My question, that sort of follows on from the last point that Geraldine was making. I'm just wondering, in your view and given your wide experience, to what extent do you feel that basic economic inequality is a driver of insecurity and conflict, especially in countries where there isn't necessarily a pathway to economic advancement? And how can we try to address that issue alongside other causes of conflict?
I think it's a great question, Michael. And my hint was in the Marshall Plan, because I think that was an extraordinary initiative that at the time was unparalleled, that the very countries or country that would be at the centre of driving war was actually going to be supported economically to recover. And that was the smart thing to do. So I've seen many, and I maybe I'm going to go off my area of expertise here, but I always look at Lebanon and say, why isn't there greater employment opportunities in South Lebanon, where for decades we've provided the framework for a safe and secure environment? Why aren't there the Googles and the Facebooks come in to actually generate and employment opportunities? Because you're dead right, economics actually provides security, and state security and economic security are two sides of the same coin. So the safe and secure environment that a peacekeeper can provide has a time limit on it before it begins to culminate. If there isn't a development in terms of the other areas, such as economics, such as the institutions for education, for health and that, if they don't bed in, the peacekeeper will culminate and have utilised his capability band, and we're likely to see a deterioration back into insecurity. So the integrated approach is really about that point, about looking at the others enablers, and that's the reason I spoke about the diplomats, the political, the investors, being there rather than being over the hill watching on. They need to be on the ground, and often the NGO community have a key role to play in that. Thank you.
Thanks, Mark. I think that one of the values of the Peacebuilding Commission here at the UN, where we're increasingly working, is that in fact it's probably the only forum I know of here that brings all those issues together, and where countries themselves bring the complex of their challenges to the table in a way that's impossible, for example, at the Security Council. So the economic dimension, the security dimension, the humanitarian need. We have countries from CAR through to Burkina Faso, Burundi last week. We've had more recently Liberia, a country that's moved along on the continuum. But it's a very conducive environment. So perhaps I'd suggest that on a future visit, we try and expose you to some of the debate in there, which really does cover that range, and that picks up on Michael's point about the roots. And you yourself used the root cause argument earlier in terms of addressing fragility and conflict. I'm just looking to see, have we exhausted Admiral Mellett, Vice Admiral Mellett, enough at this stage? I think we probably have. We're going to invite you, I'm going to stand up briefly, we're going to invite you for a short drink at the end of this. Before we thank Vice Admiral Mellett appropriately one more time, I just come back to the framing of the evening here, which is, as I said, part of the Ireland at Fordham lecture series. We've had four inspirational evenings built around, and I want to say that Mark's lecture this evening, like the previous lectures by Mary Robinson, former President Mary Robinson on climate change and insecurity, President Higgins on the topic of humanitarian action in the 21st century, and a recent lecture by Jamila Mahmood on, I'm looking for the title, on the topic of trust and localization. They will appear in a lecture series, printed lecture series that we will produce at the end. So Mark's lecture will join those. We have two upcoming, I'll just signal to you now, and you'll be invited, of course. The first is going to be by Jaime Mcgoldrick, who many of you will know as the UN Development Humanitarian Coordinator in Palestine. And we've asked Jaime to focus on the topic of humanitarian access, not a subject that we're unfamiliar with these days, and respect for international humanitarian law, something that we regard as really a fundamental issue. We'll also later have a panel discussion with Matthew Hollingworth of the World Food Programme, and he'll be joined by Katrina Dowd of Ireland's Own Concern Worldwide, on conflict and hunger. Very important topics upcoming, so I'd encourage you to keep an eye on those. We'll announce them. May I one more time thank Vice Admiral Mark Mellett. I'll never be allowed to introduce you anywhere ever again, Mark, for the really inspirational and powerful, thought-provoking ideas you put before us tonight. We're deeply grateful. Thank you very much indeed.